Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And what he's saying there is that it's something about money, but it's not a real thing. It kind of goes back to that example that I've used in previous videos, where if you think about having $100 and each ice cream cone costing $1, that means that you can actually buy 100 ice cream cones. Well, let's change the prices. Let's suppose now you've got $100 or $200 and each ice cream cone costs $2. So we've just doubled the prices. Well, you can still only buy 100 ice cream cones. Nothing's really changed at all in terms of what real things you can buy. Before we kind of go into a little bit more about this quantity theory of money, let's real quick think about what happens if money demand changes. So let's put maybe a smaller version of this model up here. So we've got the value of money, 1 over P. We've got the price level. We've got some initial money supply and some money demand. So here's our money supply, here's money demand. Let's not worry about all the numbers here because we really just want to think about what's going to happen to the value of money. And it's very intuitive when you think about what happens if, say, demand for money increases. So let's suppose that credit card companies raise their rates, or for some reason people decide to switch away from credit cards towards using more money. Maybe they don't quit using credit cards, but they use them less. And so the demand for money increases. If we have an increase, let's identify our initial equilibrium right here. If we have an increase in the demand for money, then we're going to move from that equilibrium at point A to a new equilibrium at point B, and that's going to drive up the value of money. It will also drive down the price level. Remember, the value of money and the price level are inverses of each other, so if the value of money goes up, the price level goes down. And you can see that if we were to start at this money demand, and if money demand were to decrease, it's going to drive down the value of money, which drives up the price level. Okay, so now we can think about what happens if the Fed changes the money supply, what it does to the price level or to the value of money. We can think about what happens if money demand changes. What we want to do now is think about the impact of a change in the price level on other macro variables in the economy. So let's clear this off and then we'll take a look at that. So David Hume suggested that we could take all economic variables and put them into two different categories, which we've actually talked about already in this class. We've talked about nominal variables, and then we've talked about real variables. And so what Hume said is that all economic variables can be grouped into those two categories. A nominal variable, hopefully you remember, is something that is denominated in monetary units. So it's measured in dollars. So let's put here measured in dollars, monetary units. So we've talked about things like nominal GDP. We've talked about nominal interest rates. There are other variables that we've also talked about, and those are real variables. So these are measured in physical units, not in dollars, measured in physical units. So we've talked about real GDP, we've talked about the real interest rate. The example that I just used previously when we were talking about the number of ice cream cones you can buy. So I gave you a nominal income of $100, and I gave you a price, a nominal price of $1 per ice cream cone. And then we converted that and figured out how many real ice cream cones you can buy. So your real income in that example would be 100 ice cream cones. The units of measure there are ice cream cones, physical units. But if we were to think about your nominal income, the $100, that's measured obviously in terms of dollars. So if we think about prices, it's a little bit odd to think about it in terms of price. So if we were to talk about a price is typically quoted in dollars. So that would be a nominal variable. But what we're interested in typically in economics is relative prices. So in that ice cream cone example, neither your nominal income nor your price matters by itself. The $100 of nominal income or the $1 price tag on an ice cream cone, neither of them matter individually. What matters is the relative nature of them. Your income relative to the price, or the price relative to your income. You can look at it either way. So when we think about relative prices, that's what we're going to be thinking about there. That's when we take your income and we divide it by the price to find out the number of ice cream cones you can buy. What we're thinking about there is a relative price. Okay, and it's relative prices that matters. So let me give you another example. Let's suppose a hamburger costs $1. And let's suppose a hot dog costs 50 cents. Or half a dollar. Then what that means is one hamburger costs 2 hot dogs. Or one hot dog costs 1/2 of a hamburger. That's what matters. It's that relative price. These individually do not matter. They only matter relative to each other. So when we talk about prices, prices are quoted in nominal units, in dollars. But when we think about relative prices, that's when we get the real measure. So relative prices are real measures. Nominal prices, these individually are nominal. Okay? So let's think about why this is important. What Hume said was that we can make this distinction between variables. An economic variable is either going to be nominal or real, and the money supply has an important influence over nominal variables but not real variables. So the changes in the money supply affect nominal variables but not real variables. Not real. In the monopoly example, that change in the money supply affected the nominal prices of the properties, but it didn't affect anything real about how the game was played. There were still the same number of properties on the board. The game still worked the same way. It's just that the prices were different. So if you think about the discussions that we've had so far, if you've been watching the videos in this class, then you know that we've discussed a lot of different things. And a lot of the things that we discussed, the conclusions that we came up with, didn't really have anything to do with dollars. We can discuss a huge chunk of economics without ever really thinking about monetary units, without thinking about dollars. So we talked about real GDP, the real quantity of goods and services produced in an economy. That's not determined by the number of dollars in the economy. It's determined essentially by productivity of labor, how much natural resources we have, technology. It's determined by real things. We talked about the real interest rate. The real interest rate isn't determined by the number of dollars in the system. It's determined by the demand and supply of loanable funds. We talked about real wages and the fact that the real wage is determined by the demand and supply for labor. Okay? We didn't have to talk about dollars there. We talked about unemployment. Unemployment is determined by the demand and supply for labor and adjustments in the real wage, not the nominal wage. So a lot of the discussions that we've thought about in this class, we talked about without thinking about dollars. Remember, even when going as far back as to talk about the production possibility frontier and how much of each good an economy can produce, real GDP. It had to do with where that production possibilities frontier was. And we talked about the opportunity cost of each good, but we didn't talk about it in terms of dollars. We talked about it in terms of how much of the other good you had to give up to get more of this good. So all of those discussions are discussions about real variables, not nominal variables. None of these had anything to do with money. So we've got another name for this. We call this monetary neutrality. Monetary neutrality. And that monetary neutrality, that is really the name that we give the idea that changes in the money supply are irrelevant for real variables. Okay? Real variables are monetarily neutral. Another way to think about what's going on here is to think about, say, the clock that we use. We use a clock that's based upon a division of 12 units. It's a base 12 clock. And each half day is divided into 12 hours. The military uses a different clock. They use a base 24 clock where each day is divided into 24 segments. But we don't have to do that. We could create a new clock where there are 100 hours in the day. But the day is actually not going to change. If we did that, there would monetarily be more hours in the day. But in terms of the actual day that we experience, it's no longer or shorter. We've just broken it up into smaller increments. And so that's essentially what's going on right here. Now, we're not saying that inflation or that changing that clock would be costless. We'll talk about some of the costs associated with inflation, especially high levels of inflation. Just like if we changed the clock, probably there would be a period of time during which it was confusing. Somebody would say, I'll see you at 75 o'clock, and you'd have to say, gosh, 75 o'clock, I'm just not sure exactly when that is. I think that's at night, but I'm not sure. So there would initially be some confusion until you got used to it, but what you would realize is that wouldn't have any impact on anything real. Let's talk about velocity and the monetary or the quantity equation. So let's start by thinking about what velocity is. So velocity is how many times per year the typical dollar bill would be used to pay for a newly produced good or service. So the number of times a dollar is spent in a year on a newly produced good or service. That's what we think about when we're talking about the velocity of money. It's the speed at which a dollar travels around that circular flow diagram, essentially. The velocity of money we can define, we're going to call it V. The velocity of money we define as P times Y divided by M. So this V stands for velocity, P stands for the price level, Y stands for real GDP, and M here is going to be our money supply. It's the quantity of money in the system. In my pictures that I had up here, I called the money supply MS. Here I'm just going to call it M. So what this tells us is that the velocity of money, the way that you would calculate it, is to look at the total amount of economic activity that takes place in the economy. This is the number of goods and services produced in the economy times the price level divided by the number of dollars in the system. So this is the total amount of economic activity divided by how many dollars there are, and that gives you velocity. Let's do a quick example. Let's suppose that we have a nice simple economy where only one thing is produced, and that one thing is going to be pizzas. Let's suppose there are 100 pizzas produced per year. Let's suppose the price is $10 per pizza. And let's suppose the quantity of money in the system is $50. That's our quantity of money. Then let's think about the velocity. So if there is 100 pizzas produced each year at $10 each, that's going to be the price, which is 10, times 100. That's $1,000 of economic activity that takes place in the economy. But there's only $50 in the money supply. So if we have $1,000 of economic activity and only $50 in the system, that means each dollar has to be spent on average 20 times. The velocity of money would be 20. So if you have $50 in the system, each dollar being spent on average 20 times each, that would account for $1,000 of economic activity. We can rewrite this. If we just simply multiply both sides by M, we can write M, the money supply, multiplied by the velocity of money, the average number of times each dollar is spent each year on a newly produced good or service, is equal to P times Y. P times Y over here, this is just nominal GDP. It's the price level multiplied by real GDP. Okay? This is what we call the quantity equation. So nominal GDP, the nominal amount of economic activity that is taking place in the economy, is equal to the number of dollars in the system multiplied by the number of times each dollar is spent on average. Let's think about what causes each of these things to change, or what determines the money supply, what determines velocity, the price level, and real GDP. So if we think about increasing the money supply, if we increase the money supply in order for this equation to hold, then that has to lead to one or more of the following things. In order to maintain the equality by increasing the money supply, we have to either see that we have a decrease in velocity, or we would have to have an increase in the price level, or we would have to have an increase in real GDP. Why? To maintain that equality. If this variable goes up, then to maintain the equality, this one has to go down, or that one goes up, or that one goes up, or some combination of all three of those things. It turns out that if we look at the velocity of money, that's relatively stable. This tends to be relatively stable over time. So we don't tend to see the velocity of money changing very much. We also know that real GDP is determined not by the number of dollars in the system, but determined by productivity. So this isn't affected by dollars. This is affected by the productivity of labor, by technology. So what we tend to see is that an increase in the money supply is going to be reflected with an increase in the price level. Okay? So what we need to do now, I need to clear this off, and then we'll kind of finish up this chapter with a couple of things. So now we have a better understanding of what causes inflation, at least in the long run. So what we've talked about here is this quantity theory of money, that the changes in the price level are going to be related to changes in the money supply. We've talked about monetary neutrality, the idea that when the money supply changes, when we have changes in the price level, that's going to affect nominal variables, but it doesn't affect real variables. Again, all of this is a long-run idea. We'll talk about the fact that a change in the money supply can have an impact on some real variables in the short run. That's in another discussion that we'll have. But in the long run, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's not something that has enormous, large impacts on real variables. Now, we can talk about very high rates of inflation. So if we talk about what's known as hyperinflation, hyperinflation would be inflation that exceeds, say, 50% per month. So remember at the beginning I talked about the average rate of inflation that we tend to see in the U.S. economy is somewhere maybe in the neighborhood of 4 to 5%. It depends on the year. And that's 4 to 5% per year, so less than 1% per month. So if we're thinking about high rates of inflation, higher than 50% per month, that's a lot of inflation. That is rapid increases in the price level, rapid decreases in the value of money. And kind of the classic example of hyperinflation is what happened in Zimbabwe. I actually have some currency from Zimbabwe. So in 2007, the Zimbabwe government decided to start printing money. There were a variety of reasons why they decided to start doing that, but they started printing money, and they were printing money rapidly. They continued that for a while until I believe they eventually ran out of money printing supplies and contracted with some other governments to print money for them. Eventually it all stopped and they had to switch to using U.S. dollars because they had some very severe problems in their economy. But let's talk about what happens when an economy does that. When you have an economy where they're printing large quantities of money, then what that does, we've seen, is it devalues the money. So the value of money starts falling rapidly, and what that means is people need to carry large quantities of money to buy things. So as Zimbabwe started printing money very rapidly, the value started to fall, and people were having to carry wheelbarrow loads of money, of bills, to make purchases. So what the government decided to do was to print bills in larger denominations. Now, you won't be able to see these, but we'll put a picture up here so that you can kind of see a couple of these. But what these are bills from Zimbabwe in 2007. They had a $1 bill, they had a $5 bill, they had a $10 bill, a $20, and a $1,000 bill. And these are bills that are very similar to what you would see in any country. They started printing money. The value of their currency started to fall, and so as they were printing money, they started to print higher denominations. And so still in this is early 2008, they decided to print a $500,000 bill. That's that bill. They then went to a $50 million bill, a $200 million bill, a $500 million bill. This is still in 2008. They went from there to a $1 billion bill. That is a $1 billion bill. Still would not buy very much of anything in Zimbabwe at the time. They printed a $5 billion bill, $10 billion, $20 billion, $50 billion. Here's a $10 trillion bill, $10 trillion. Here's a $50 trillion bill, and then finally a $100 trillion bill. Still would not buy very much of anything in Zimbabwe because the price level was rising so rapidly, the value of their money was falling so rapidly that essentially other countries stopped printing money for them, and again they had to switch to using the U.S. dollar or currencies from other countries because the Zim dollar, Zimbabwe's currency, had no value. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly how much inflation they were experiencing because they quit reporting official statistics, but there are some estimates out there, And it turns out that if you estimate at the height of the inflation, how much inflation they were actually experiencing, it was something around 800 billion% per month. 800 billion% per month. If you look at how much inflation per year that is around 90 sextillion% per year. Now, those are estimates. We don't know exactly how much it was, but the point is that is incredibly high inflation. Okay, if you think about inflation in the U.S., 4 to 5%, in a year with high inflation, maybe something around 7, 8, 9%, way lower than what was experienced in Zimbabwe. And it's not just Zimbabwe. Other countries have experienced hyperinflation, but what's happening there is that the government is printing money rapidly, that's devaluing their currency and driving up the price level. Let's talk about what we call an inflation tax. So you might ask, well, if this is obvious that if the government increases money, the money supply is just going to create inflation, it's going to cause our dollars to be less valuable, why would a government do this? Well, when a government is doing this, we say that the government is imposing an inflation tax on its citizens. So essentially, the government is using money creation as a way to pay for some of its spending. So they create new money and it devalues the money that we have. They're able to spend a few more dollars. And we bear the cost of that. In terms of how much money the U.S. government creates, well, if we're experiencing, say, 4% inflation per year, then that gives you an idea of what the rate at which they're increasing the money supply is, around 4%. Let's talk about the Fisher effect, which is actually something we've already discussed in a previous video, but we didn't call it the Fisher effect at that point. But what the Fisher effect is the application of monetary neutrality to interest rates. So we know that the real interest rate, let's just call it R, the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. We can rearrange that and say that the nominal interest rate is equal to the real rate plus the rate of inflation. Now, changes in the money supply are going to cause, if we have an increase in the money supply, we know that that's going to cause an increase in the inflation rate. The real interest rate is not determined by the quantity of money in the economy. The real interest rate, remember we talked about that, the real interest rate is determined by the demand and supply of loanable funds. So what the Fisher effect tells us is that money creation by the government will cause inflation and drive up nominal interest rates, but will not affect real interest rates. Okay? This is that classical dichotomy, that a change in the money supply will affect the nominal interest rate, but not the real interest rate. We call that the Fisher effect. The Fisher effect, again, is something that holds in the long run. We can talk about what happens in the short run. We'll discuss that in a later discussion. But keep in mind, all of these things about monetary neutrality and the classical dichotomy are long-run ideas, not so much short-run ideas. Let's talk about, finish up by thinking about the costs of inflation. So we've said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't impose some costs on us. So I've already mentioned that it's probably the most discussed, the most feared thing that people in the general public would think about happening in an economy. But in terms of its effect in the long run, it doesn't matter. It's a monetary phenomenon. But it does impose some costs. Let's think about a few of them. Different textbooks have different names for some of these, but here's what we're going to call these. The first one we could call the shoe leather cost. And the idea here is that inflation results in more frequent trips to the bank to get cash to engage in transactions. Now, most people these days use a debit card, and so you don't actually have to go to the bank to withdraw cash to make transactions. So this isn't as big a cost as what it used to be when more people had to carry cash. But we still say that it results maybe in more frequent transfers of money from your savings account into your checking account so that you can engage in transactions. So it increases the number of times you have to think about the amount of money that you're holding. We call that the shoe leather cost. There's also what we call menu costs. So this is a cost associated with repeatedly having to change prices. So you can think about maybe a restaurant printing up some menus where they have prices of different items on there. And then if the economy is experiencing a lot of inflation and those prices need to be adjusted frequently, then that's going to impose some costs on that restaurant in terms of printing up new menus. It's not just restaurants, any business that posts prices, whether those prices are posted on signs or on stickers on the item or on little signs under the item or on a catalog that they may mail out or maybe on a website. As prices change frequently, they have to go and change those prices, and we just call those menu costs. There's also relative price variability. And the idea here is that when we experience inflation, it's not the case that all prices change by the same amount. Prices do not change proportionally. Some prices may go up more than others. Some prices may actually go down. But inflation creates relative price variability, and so it increases the amount of thought that you have to give to the things that you buy. Okay? And that imposes costs on us. There's also what we would call inflation-induced tax distortions. Inflation-induced tax distortions. So it's often the case that lawmakers change laws and then fail to take into consideration the fact that inflation can distort the incentives that people face. And when people face different incentives, we know that their behavior is going to change. So it can create distortions in behavior that lawmakers don't anticipate. And then let's just say that one of them kind of related to that, just confusion and inconvenience. In the same way that if we changed the clock to a base 100 clock, that would initially create some confusion. It would be hard to figure out exactly what part of the day a particular time might be referring to. So it creates some confusion and inconvenience when prices are constantly changing. If you were in Zimbabwe when those prices were rising that rapidly, those prices are going up second by second. So a roll of toilet paper in the morning would cost a different amount than that roll of toilet paper in the evening. That creates confusion and inconvenience. It makes it hard to plan for the future. And then the final one, let's talk about arbitrary redistribution of wealth. Arbitrary redistribution of wealth. The idea here is that unexpected inflation will impact people who borrow money and people who lend money. So let's write out here what it does, and then I'll give you an example of why. Unexpected inflation helps borrowers. Unexpected inflation helps borrowers. It hurts lenders. It hurts creditors. Let me give you an example of why. Let's suppose that we live in Zimbabwe and I I borrow $1,000 from you right now, before all of that inflation happened. I borrow $1,000, and we don't know that all that inflation is going to happen. We're just going about our business, and I say, hey, look, I'd like to borrow $1,000 from you, and so you lend me $1,000, and in a year, I'm going to be paying you back this $1,000 plus some interest. And then over the course of that year, the Zimbabwe government starts to print money, and the value of money starts falling. We experience high rates of inflation, and neither of us expected that, but the agreement between us is that in 1 year I'm going to pay you back $1,000 plus some interest. And then over the course of that year, there's this tremendous amount of inflation. And at the end of the year, I say, hey, I owe you $1,000. So how about this? How about if I just give you a $100 trillion bill and we'll just call it even? And this thing's worth hardly anything. It's worth less than what that $1,000 was a year ago that I borrowed. So that unexpected inflation is going to help me as the borrower. I get to pay you back with dollars that are worth less than when I borrowed them. The unexpected inflation hurts the lender. If we knew that that inflation was going to happen, then you would build that into the contract that we had. If you knew over the course of the year there was going to be a whole bunch of inflation, then you would build that inflation into the nominal interest rate that you charge me. You would need to get some real rate, and then you'd say, okay, we're going to be experiencing this high rate of inflation, so I'm going to take the real rate I need to get, plus the inflation we're going to experience, and you're going to have to pay this nominal rate. But if you don't expect the inflation, then you're going to charge me a nominal rate that is lower than what you needed to charge me. So unexpected inflation arbitrarily redistributes wealth. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what the cause of inflation is, at least in the long run. This idea of the quantity theory of money, the quantity of money being directly related to the value of that money. Hopefully now you understand that nominal variables are impacted by changes in the money supply and real variables aren't in the long run. And then we've talked a little bit about some of the costs of inflation. So we'll think about how things happen in the short run in a future discussion, and I'll see you in a future video.